All right, good evening, everyone, and welcome to this evening's edition of the Skeptic's Toolbox. My name is Jennifer Bien, and I'm the Executive Director of Center for Inquiry Michigan, and I'm also your host for tonight's event. The Skeptic's Toolbox was created in 1989 by Ray Hyman, Lauren Pankratz, and Jerry Andrews to help teach people how to be better skeptics and critical thinkers. 30 years later, critical thinking and scientific skepticism are more important than ever. And so to continue the important legacy started by the founders, CFI is expanding and rebooting the Skeptic's Toolbox by developing a collection of online resources and training events to equip you, our supporters around the world, with practical tools and techniques to apply critical thinking and skepticism in your daily lives, and to help you fight against misinformation and deception. So you can learn more about this program at skepticstoolbox.org and enjoy the online resources and training events, the videos on there on the website as well. A couple of quick notes before we welcome tonight's guest. Live closed captioning is available and can be enabled in the menu bar at the bottom of your Zoom window. If you have questions, please submit them via the Q&A function located also at the bottom in the menu bar of your Zoom window. And we will answer as many of those as we can at the end of tonight's presentation. Tonight's webinar is being recorded, and the video will be added to the Skeptic's Toolbox webpage at skepticstoolbox.org, and it will also be available on CFI's YouTube channel. So tonight we welcome Andy Norman to the Skeptic's Toolbox to teach us 5 ways to inoculate ourselves against viral nonsense. Andy Norman directs the Humanism Initiative at Carnegie Mellon University. He studies how ideologies short-circuit minds and corrupt moral understanding, and develops tools to help people reason together in more fruitful ways. His new book, Mental Immunity, Infectious Ideas, Mind Parasites, and the Search for a Better Way to Think, lays out the conceptual foundations of cognitive immunology, the emerging science of mental immune health. You can learn more about Andy and his work at his website, andynorman.org. And Andy Norman, welcome to the Skeptic's Toolbox.
Thank you, Jennifer. It's a pleasure to be here. And thank you all for being with us. I understand we have a huge crowd tonight, and I'm very heartened by the interest in this topic. We need skepticism, we need critical thinking, and we need debunking these days, perhaps more than we ever have. I have a book out on the subject. It's just come out a month ago. It's called Mental Immunity, Infectious Ideas, Mind Parasites, A Search for a Better Way to Think. And it contains many tools for skeptics and free thinkers. And I'm delighted to have a chance to share a few of them with you this evening. First, I want to start with a provocation. Did you know that ancient philosophers discovered some very powerful arguments that seem to show, and still seem to show, that nothing is reasonable? That they became ardent skeptics, waged a kind of culture war on behalf of their skepticism, and actually generated a devastating backlash. Their arguments made it look as though dogmatic faith is the only alternative to cognitive freefall. And they helped to bring about a 1,000-year dark age in which dogmatic thinkers essentially controlled the most powerful institutions in medieval Europe. In fact, skeptical overreach and dogmatic backlash have riven societies for thousands of years, in part because we haven't figured out an appropriate way to balance the interests of believers and skeptics. And I hope to speak to that question today. Now, my title promises 5 ways to inoculate minds against viral nonsense. And these ways actually stem from an emerging science I call cognitive immunology, the science of mental immune health. So I want to deliver on those 2 promises and then conclude with a few lessons for skepticism as a program and as a, shall we say, a movement. Let me begin with a story. Hundreds of years ago, mysterious afflictions visited our ancestors. People would become ill and nobody knew why. Devastating epidemics would spread through populations, killing sometimes millions of people, and nobody could understand what was causing them. And then, in relatively short order, everything changed. A Dutch microscopist named Antoine van Leeuwenhoek trained a small primitive microscope on the world of the very, very small and discovered a world teeming with microbial life. It wasn't too long thereafter that the germ theory of disease took hold in the West. People began inoculating people against germs. And within a century, the science of immunology and vaccine creation became a real thing that ended up saving billions of human lives and deeply transforming the human condition. Now, I think that today, in these internet-connected times, we're seeing mysterious afflictions spread across social networks, digitally connected social networks, infecting minds with things like conspiracy thinking and science denial and divisive ideologies and extremist worldviews. And we're struggling to make sense. What is happening? Why is this happening? And what can we do about it? The good news is that a better understanding of how bad ideas spread is coming into focus within the sciences. I like to call it the germ theory of cognitive contagion. And the basic idea is quite simple. Bad ideas are mind parasites, and they can spread from mind to mind, infect populations, and create, in some cases, horribly dysfunctional behavior. More good news, scientists have been experimenting with mind inoculation techniques for about 60 years and have discovered that minds actually behave as if they have immune systems. And now, in our own time, the science of mental immunity is coming together and promising to deliver something like mind vaccines that could once again transform the human condition. Let me tell you a little bit about this science. Here's some of its tenets. I already mentioned one. Bad ideas, especially infectious ones, are mind parasites. Number two, minds do in fact have immune systems, which is to say, infrastructure that functions to spot and remove bad ideas. Doubts, qualms, reservations, it turns out, are the antibodies of the mind. Mental immune systems have a dual job. They're supposed to let in good ideas, let in true beliefs, let in true ideas so that they can become beliefs. And they're also supposed to screen out bad ideas and falsehoods. And of course, those two jobs are sometimes in tension, because the more you open your mind to good ideas, the more likely it is that some bad ideas will get in as well. And so mental immune health actually involves a balancing act in the same way that bodily immune health requires an immune system in the Goldilocks zone between overactive and underactive. Mental immune systems do in fact function more or less well. They can be compromised, they can be underdeveloped, they can be boosted or strengthened. Mental immune disorders exist, in part because immune disruptive ideas actually circulate through our culture, weakening our resistance to bad ideas. It even turns out that there are autoimmune disorders of the mind, which is to say, so an autoimmune disorder of the body's immune system is one where the body's immune system becomes hyperactive and attacks the body's own tissues. So if you've ever suffered from seasonal allergies, that's your body's immune system overreacting to pollen or some other, or dust or some other allergen. And it turns out there's a completely analogous mental phenomenon where the mind goes into fight or flight mode and attacks good information as though it were a threat. So the science of mental immunity, people who are studying mental immune systems now are asking questions like, how do they work? Why do they fail? And how can we make them work better? And my book provides sort of a detailed account of the state of this new science, lays out the conceptual foundations of the science, and argues that we can take this science, we can take critical thinking to new heights if we develop this science and apply it in the right way. I also want to say that all this talk of mental immune systems and mind parasites is not just metaphor. This strikes almost everyone as metaphorical language at first, but metaphors have a long history of morphing into literal usages if they prove sufficiently useful. And I'm convinced that this is happening with the language employed by cognitive immunologists right now. The evidence is piling up that mental immune systems exist. The concepts are like a lens that bring a domain that my philosophical forebears struggled to think clearly about. It brings it into startlingly clear focus, reveals hidden aspects of mental function, and uncovers root causes of, for example, epidemics of unreason. So without further ado, I want to deliver on my main promise, which is to offer 5 ways to strengthen mental immune systems. Now, I do hope to give you some ideas that will allow you to strengthen the mental immune systems in your orbit, family, friends, people you care about, students, perhaps, those you have conversations with. But first and foremost, I'd like you to focus on internalizing these principles in such a way as to heighten or strengthen your own mental immune system, and then simply converse and lead by example. And I think that by exemplifying what it's like to have a robustly healthy mental immune system, we can help others develop immunity in ways that don't cause them to push back. So principle number 1 is listen to your doubts, because they are your mind's antibodies. They're our friends. Many people, I think, experience doubts as anxiety causing. What they're not realizing is that doubts are actually your mind trying to call your attention to a problematic feature of an idea or a proposal or a course of action. If you learn to listen to them, you'll start to hear even the little voice in the back of your head that's saying, there's something not quite right here. Learn to listen to that voice, zoom in on it, hear what it has to say, and you will start to become more sensitive to the bad-making features of ideas, the qualities or properties of ideas that make them objectively problematic. There's a corollary of this principle, and it has to do with the kind of doubts that other people raise about your ideas. And the corollary is treat other people's challenges and objections as opportunities rather than threats. So if somebody raises an objection to an idea that you feel strongly about, it's very easy to get defensive. That's your mind's immune system coming to your defense, or coming to the defense of your beliefs. And treating the new information from the other party as a kind of threat. It's very, very easy for the mind's immune system to get confused and attack good information and give bad information a pass. And so a deliberate effort to calm the mind and treat the arguments of people on the other side of, say, the political aisle, or the other side of religious secular debates, a deliberate effort to try to find something of value in what the other side has to say. Try to learn from what they have to say, and your mind's immune system will grow stronger. Second principle, hold your beliefs loosely. they're not you. If you end up having to let go of a belief, you will very likely not find yourself in cognitive free fall. You'll very likely find an alternative belief or an alternative conviction that does most of what you need of what the original belief did for you. The Yale psychologist Dan Kahan has identified something he calls identity protective cognition. Here's the idea. Ideas, if you hitch your identity to cherished ideas, then any question or challenge of those ideas or those beliefs feel like a threat to you personally, and you're unlikely to be able to weigh those objections with any kind of fair-mindedness. And the moral of the story is that it's a bad idea to let your beliefs define you or let your beliefs define your identity. So hold your beliefs loosely, be ready to part with them as soon as they're shown to be sufficiently problematic, and your mind's immune system will get stronger, less prone to overreacting to perceived threats. Principle number 3, never indulge in willful belief. So it turns out that indulging in willful belief actually damages the mechanism that allows evidence to update and enlighten people's minds. Many people assume that you can indulge in wishful thinking about one domain and that your mind will remain perfectly capable of thinking in evidence-based ways in other domains. The evidence now suggests that that's not true. There's a research team out of Canada led by Gordon Pennycook that has found that the moment you compromise, he calls it a meta-belief. There's a meta-belief that was once expressed by the economist John Maynard Keynes. He said, when the facts change, I change my mind. What do you do, sir? The way Pennycook phrases this idea is that beliefs should change in response to evidence. The moment you begin compromising that meta-belief, Keynes's conviction, it turns out you become more susceptible to religious extremism, conspiracy thinking, science denial, divisive political ideologies, weird and dysfunctional forms of thinking of many kinds. These things are strongly correlated, and it's starting to look as though this meta-belief, the commitment to change in the face of your mind, in the face of evidence, it's starting to look as though that meta-belief is the linchpin of the mind's immune system. I call this belief, in the book, I call this belief reason's fulcrum. Here's the idea. If you're committed to yielding in the face of better reasons, you will become essentially receptive to learning from reasons, even inconvenient reasons. So a lot of times we find ourselves disinclined to change our minds. And unless we're firmly committed to changing our minds when the evidence indicates a need to, a lot of times we'll just stand pat and hang on to the beliefs that we imagine serve us well. You can gain a kind of short-term sense of, stability by indulging in that way of thinking, in compromising your commitment to reason's fulcrum, but it almost always has long-term effects that will harm your prospects or the prospects of the people around you. So if you want a strong mental immune system, a mental immune system that does a good job of distinguishing between good ideas and bad ideas, truths and falsehoods, never indulge in willful belief. And of course, a corollary of this is that you should never use faith or wishful thinking as an excuse to hang on to beliefs that you find important. I will say this, and this is an observation that might prove helpful to your more religious or spiritual friends. While faith-based believing turns out to be morally problematic, and I show that, I demonstrate that in the book, while that's true, resolute hopefulness does not have that defect. So if you learn to distinguish between tenacious believing and resolute hopefulness, a lot of times you can get everything you want from faith, but without the metaphysical trappings and intellectually questionable assumptions. Principle number 4. Actually, I guess I already said this one. Always yield to the better reason. So embrace reason's fulcrum. It's the linchpin of the mind's immune system. Every time you yield to the better reason, even when you do small things like decline the cookie for the sake of a healthier dessert, every time you do, I'm assuming for the sake of argument here that reasons favor the healthier dessert. If you, in fact, yield to that better reason and do the healthier but less immediately gratifying thing, your mind's immune system, your commitment to reason's fulcrum gets a little bit stronger. And every time I, for example, decide to waste a Sunday afternoon watching NFL football, which I know is not a reasonable thing to do, I'm sure that my mind's immune system gets a little weaker. So I have my defects as a rationalist myself, but in the book, I actually ask us to imagine what it would be like if we all had a deep, passionate commitment to yielding in the face of better reasons. How much more dialogue would do to reconcile us? How much more rapidly science would advance? How much our ability to solve problems together would advance? How many fruitless political discourses would actually become fruitful again if we all bought into this one linchpin principle? In fact, I come close to arguing that reason's fulcrum deserves to be sacralized. And I poke a little fun at the Abrahamic religions for not including it. I poke a little fun at Yahweh for not including it among the 10 commandments. Interestingly, a deep commitment to reason's fulcrum is curiously faith-like in that you are submitting to the force of the better reason. The word Islam, for example, means submission. And of course, many people imagine that religious faith is fundamentally about submitting to a higher power. Well, I think that we rationalists, we skeptics, have a form of submission of our own, and it's submission to reality or submission to the better reasons that we derive by studying and observing reality. Principle 5, always reason to find out rather than to win. If the person you're talking to has the feeling that you're using reasons to defeat them in argument, you're very, very unlikely to change their mind. Study after study show that people dig their heels in if you start treating reasons as weapons. So the moment you feel as though you need to do battle, to wage war on behalf of skepticism or humanism or naturalism, the moment that demeanor creeps over you in the course of a conversation with a believer, that's the moment they start to tune you out. To have fruitful conversations with people of faith, you have to keep first and foremost the idea that it's a conversation where each side uses reasons not as weapons, but as attempts to guide each other's attention to relevant considerations. So treat reasons as pointers, not weapons. You'll de-escalate the kind of debates that are right now dividing our nation, and the kind of political and religious or culture war conversations that are currently so fruitless can begin to become fruitful again. Now, you may have a hard time actually bringing yourself to a state of mind where you think that there's a realistic possibility, say, that a God believer might persuade you to believe in God. If you can't actually bring yourself to the point where you're genuinely open-minded about that question, at least make sure that your demeanor speaks your openness, your willingness to hear their reasons, because until you're able to show that you're open to their reasons, they won't open up to yours. Final word, and then I'm eager to hear your questions. I think there's some less cognitive immunology also has lessons for skepticism as a phenomenon. Number one, critical thinking is not enough. In fact, you can be too critical for your own good. Think about flat Earth theorists. They're enormously gullible about the claims about the Earth's flatness, but they're also more skeptical than you are, more critical than you are about some of the evidence for the Earth's spherical nature. It's not that flat Earth theorists are uncritical. In fact, they're hypercritical about many things and undercritical about others. They don't direct their skepticism or their criticism at the right things. So it's actually a mistake, I think, to imagine that we skeptics are the ones that are truly skeptical and them, our cultural detractors, are not. Or we're the critical thinkers and they're not. That's a far too simplistic and misleading characterization of the situation. Trust me, there are many people, religious apologists, for example, who are way more sophisticated than you are on certain crazy branches of the debate between believers and non-believers. And they can be more skeptical than you are on some things, even while they're less skeptical than you on others. The important thing is to wield reasons, questions, skepticism, and criticism in the right way. It's not just a matter of the total amount of skepticism or the amount of criticism or the degree of skepticism that you have. It's a much more complex and subtle thing than that. Also, skills and tools aren't enough. I love the name of this series, Skeptic's Toolbox. But don't imagine that having critical thinking skills or that having skeptical tools is enough. Our universities have been imparting critical thinking skills for close to a century now. And what often happens is that a young person graduates from a college and begins wielding critical thinking skills as weapons. You know, you learn how to analyze and dissect arguments. A lot of people go out there and they use those analytical skills to dissect the arguments of the political factions they disapprove of, but they don't turn the same skills or criticisms on their own views. So selective use of criticism, selective use of skeptical tools is a big phenomenon. And our nation's universities are actually producing people who can use their critical thinking skills to become more effective propagandists, which is to say, it's important to surround skills with the right dispositions, sensibilities, and habits of mind, fair-mindedness, among others, humility. Unless you combine critical thinking skills with these other things, you won't achieve what I call mental immune health. And as my story at the very beginning hinted, indiscriminate skepticism can be bad. In fact, if you study history through the lens provided by cognitive immunology, intellectual history, you find that many of the worst outbreaks of dogmatic tenacity happen in the wake of extreme forms of skepticism that frighten people. So overweening skepticism sometimes creates a cultural backlash, leading to periods of dogmatism. The period of dogmatic ascendancy that I referred to earlier lasted more than 1,000 years. They call it the Dark Ages for a reason. And there are some signs that dogmatic tenacity is making a comeback in our time, and we need to address this issue in ways that understand the science of mental immunity. Finally, I'll just say that I think that cognitive immunology is going to take us far, far beyond where the critical thinking paradigm has taken us. And it holds the promise of bringing our species to the point where we actually have something like herd immunity to cognitive contagion. I hope this sounds like an attractive future. I hope you'll find the book, check it out, apply some of its ideas. I've only given you a taste of a few of them here, but join me, and together I think we can change the world. Thank you.
All right, great, Andy. I love the I guess the metaphor, but I guess I like the structure that you're outlining there, because that's a discussion that we end up having a lot within CFI and amongst our skeptics and allies, that you can't just go out and argue with people all day long online, and how tiring that is, and how it doesn't really seem to help get us anywhere. So I think this is a great model for us to start switching to. And I know that you are familiar with Anthony Magnabosco's approach as well, and that dovetails really well as our last Skeptics Toolbox had here.
Just spoke with Anthony. Apologies for the interruption. Yeah, I just spoke with Anthony a couple of days ago, and yeah, we're both very excited to be swapping notes, because we think we're onto something in different ways. We have a piece of something that's really important.
We'll keep us posted. Sounds interesting. So we've got some great questions here. Let me change my screen. The first question comes from Guillerme. It says, but isn't this anxiety that comes with doubt something that makes sense? If we extrapolate the idea of a mental immune system, if the antibodies are active on us, we have inflammations, etc. Yeah, hold on. Yeah, he was saying, how do you, I guess the idea that if you're going to make this an idea of the mental immune system, shouldn't we have those antibodies, those doubts to help protect us?
Absolutely. I think doubts are really important. And when I think I probably should have mentioned the other side of this. Listen to your doubts and you become more sensitive to the defects of ideas. Tune out your doubts and you become more oblivious to the bad making features of bad ideas. And you're going to end up buying into more bad ones, making mistakes, showing poorer judgment overall. I want to give an example here. I was raised in a family that practically worshiped Martin Luther King. And when I learned decades later that Martin Luther King was unfaithful to his wife, when I first heard that piece of information, my mind immediately generated antibodies to fight off this unwelcome information. Martin Luther King was unfaithful? No. That can't possibly be true. He was a paragon of moral rectitude. My mind actually generated the possibility that J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI created that story as a way of smearing King. That was my mind's immune system trying to fight off unwelcome information and protect something I cherish, a belief that I cherished. So this can happen to all of us. It's not as though the moment you label yourself a skeptic, you become immune to these things. Mental immune systems are complicated. They can misfire in dozens and dozens of different ways. I talk about many of them in the book. And you have to learn how they work and how to make it work, how to make mental immune systems work properly if you're not going to fall prey to these kinds of mistakes.
I think in that sense, your allergy analogy is quite apt, right? Because we can have allergies and be sensitive to things and it's okay. But if you get too sensitive, then you go into shock and then it becomes a problem.
Right? That's right.
Mike asks, it seems as though you're describing a healthy mental immune response as something very similar to curiosity. To what extent is curiosity a sign of a healthy or troubled mental immune system?
Oh, that's a lovely question. I think curiosity, wonder, and awe are attitudes that are closely associated with mental immune health. but they're not enough all by themselves. So think about the 4-year-old who believes in the tooth fairy, not because they lack a sense of wonder. Like, I mean, children are actually marvelously curious and have this wide-eyed wonder at the world that is a beautiful thing. But they'll also believe you when you tell them the tooth fairy is real. So curiosity alone isn't enough to inoculate your mind against falsehoods like the tooth fairy is going to sneak under your pillow and take your tooth, right? So it does require skills as well as curiosity, which again brings us back to the importance of the toolbox and what you guys do here on the show.
Good. KK asks, this is a great question. Can you give us tips for demonstrating or constructing an open and weaponless demeanor during conversations?
Yeah. I mean, I guess you have to kind of, well, here's maybe a story will help to convey part of what I have to offer on this front. I was once discussing gay marriage with a religious friend, and this religious friend expressed his opposition to gay marriage. Now, I immediately remember thinking, this idiot is wanting to take away somebody's rights. And I almost responded in a way that was incredulous, that showed that I disdain. But I knew that wouldn't preserve our friendship. So instead, I just kind of affected a mild curiosity, nodded carefully, took a deep breath, and just said, really, you think it's a good idea to prevent consenting adults from sanctifying their commitment to each other and celebrating their love just because they happen to be both male or both female? And he said, yeah. And then instead of trying to browbeat him or to make him feel as though he was morally backward, what I did was I asked clarifying questions. So I said, well, let me get this straight. Do you think that it's a good idea to treat other people the way you like to be treated? This guy was Christian, and he seemed to be convinced that, yeah, that would put him on firm ground. And he said, sure. And I said, well, how would you like it if somebody else used their articles of faith to push for public policies that denied you rights? Because that's what you're proposing that your articles of faith entitle you to. And he stopped and he just thought about it for like a full minute. And he was able to actually, my point actually kind of sunk in part because I was very careful not to adopt the demeanor I call the sort of the way of the culture warrior, right? I actually tried to maintain the stance of a friend who was gently trying to help him understand something that he hadn't seen yet. And he actually seemed deeply affected by this, by my use of these questions. And of course, just kind of maintaining, keeping an expression of disdain off my face, which I was tempted. that was an important part of the whole experience.
Yeah, that's good. And like you said, that really is a skill. It's something that's not easy to do naturally. You do have to learn how to do that.
I think practice helps a lot. And you know, I got to teach, facilitate discussions about very controversial issues in philosophy classrooms for 25 years. So I made a lot of mistakes, a lot of trial and error. But of course, a teacher is a philosophy teacher is charged not with disabusing people of their beliefs, but to just help them think about it more clearly. And so it was kind of built into my job description to approach these things in a constructive, collaborative way. And so I developed a process that I call the way of collaborative inquiry, which I think can be clearly distinguished from the way of the culture warrior. And if you embrace the way of collaborative inquiry and bring that collaborative spirit to the hard conversations, people will start listening to you in ways that they might not otherwise.
I think we could all do better in that sense. Let's see here. I apologize if I say this name wrong, but Ilya would like to know, how does the idea of identity protective cognition or mental immunity relate to cultural relativism and national pride and tribalism? Is it possible that tribalism thrives when individuals have very weak mental immunity and is used as a protective mechanism by groups and individuals within these tribes?
Wow, that's a wonderful question and reflects somebody who's really connecting the dots here. Nice job, Ilya. Great question. So yeah, one thing to note is that people often choose identities that connect them to groups. So I'm a Christian, or I'm a Republican, or I'm a Democrat, or I'm a student. Each of these is a role that connects us and gives us a sense of belonging. And all of us need to feel like we belong. And so we gravitate to the convictions that keep us in good standing within a tribe of one kind or another. And any attempt to dislodge those beliefs almost feels, or our evolved brains perceive them as attacks on our tribe, right? So identity protective cognition is presumably something that evolved to cement coalitional loyalty within a tribe. And the problem is it makes you think in ways that are maybe good for your standing within a tribe, or maybe good for tribal solidarity, but actually bad for truth, and perhaps even bad for the greater flourishing of humanity writ large. So we need to resist identity protective cognition. And one good way to do that is to, if you need an identity to give you a sense of belonging, and most of us do, identify as a skeptic, identify as a humanist, identify as a free thinker. When you hitch your identity to the idea of honest inquiry, instead of to a set of beliefs that may or may not prove to be serving you well, you remain in principle open to learning, even the things that change your core convictions. But as soon as you hitch your identity to a set of beliefs, you stop learning about certain things and frustrate your own moral growth.
That's very interesting. A short personal aside that is a good illustration of this is I was raised in a fundamentalist Christian family, and I came to skepticism via Carl Sagan and Contact. And
Nice. I
found critical thinking and humanism and skepticism to actually be a huge broadening of this idea of questions. Beliefs can be questioned. Questions can be asked for the sake of asking questions and just being curious about the world. Because where I was coming out of, everything was, this is what you believe because the Bible says so, and then you're done. And I always wanted to know why. And
I'm guessing you experienced that as liberating, yeah?
Yes, very, very much so. So I hated the answer because I said so. But if you could tell me why a rule was the way it is, then of course I'll follow it, or a reason for believing or not believing anything. And so I find that to be very liberating, but I see a huge dichotomy between that religious mindset, that they can't understand why we think changing ideas and changing our beliefs is such a good thing. I think we need to somehow bridge that. And I haven't figured out how to do that very well myself yet either.
And in the book, I actually imagine reforming the world's religions so that they erect cathedrals not to certain fixed beliefs, but instead to enlightened belief change. My idea for that came from a building just a couple of miles from where I stand called the Cathedral of Learning at the University of Pittsburgh. This is a 35-story Gothic cathedral that was, I think, built by rail baron funds, steel baron funds. And it's an edifice actually built to honor the process of enlightened belief change, because that's what learning is, right? And if we can all give up the idea of hitching our identities to static beliefs and instead hitch our identities to the idea of continual growth and improvement, I think we could do a hell of a lot to improve our world.
I think that's going to take a lot of work, but I think it's a wonderful idea.
Hey, can I build on one other aspect of Ilya's question here? Skeptics, the term skepticism and the term critical thinker both suggest a recognition that it's important to unlearn the wrong things. Learning isn't just about adding information to your brain. It's also about subtracting out the wrong stuff. Add the good stuff, but pull out the bad stuff. Skeptics, critical thinkers, both have it kind of built into their name. That's what I call subtractive learning is really important. So we tend to imagine that learning is just additive, like our brains are like a bucket and learning is just throwing the facts and the information and the evidence into the bucket. No, true learning involves throwing in the good stuff, realizing that you've overdone it sometimes and pulling out and weeding out some of the bad stuff. You want a mental garden that's genuinely beautiful, weed it with good ideas, but also, seed it with good ideas, but also weed it of bad ones.
That's a very good analogy and leads perfectly into this next question. How do you define a bad idea? And couldn't the definition of bad idea slide into a more dogmatic rather than rational area? So what are those weeds we need to actually take out?
Yeah, this is a wonderful question because it's kind of foundational for my whole project, right? So a couple things to notice. First of all, the term bad idea doesn't have to mean idea I happen, perhaps for accidental reasons, to disapprove of. Sometimes we imagine that bad idea just means idea I dislike, or good idea just means idea I approve of. But we don't have to use those terms in that way. Instead, we can use the word bad idea to mean idea that has objectively problematic properties. So ideas have properties. They have logical properties, and they have causal properties. We can actually examine those properties the way a scientist examines anything else in our universe, discover what those properties are, test our conclusions about those properties, and reach something like a scientific consensus about whether an idea is objectively true and serving us well, or somehow lacking in one or the other respect. In fact, philosophy, the entire discipline of philosophy is based on the idea that we can, by carefully examining the properties of ideas, identify which ones are really bad and which ones are really good, and do a better job of sorting them. So there's a prevailing relativism that basically says, well, who's to say which ideas are good and which ideas are bad? That relativism basically subverts critical thinking right out of the gates. You got to get rid of the idea that value judgments like good and bad or right and wrong are merely subjective. Because as I argue, as I show in the book, that idea is a mental immune disruptor that will prevent you from thinking critically about the most important things human beings have to think about.
Yeah, that's definitely where a lot of things certainly seem to get complicated. So here's a little bit different question. Luis asks, how does one overcome the tendency to stay silent in conversations with believers or conspiracy theorists in order to not hurt their feelings? Yeah. It seems that ideas presented here are not going to have much of an audience in people who have a predisposition for rational thinking, but would there be any hope to have a religious-minded person hear this message?
Yeah. So one thing I want to say is that people keep saying, Andy, this project sounds great, but the people who need it most aren't going to buy your book. Well, I'm sure there's a lot of truth to that, right? And there's be a lot of reluctance on the part of some to embrace what the book has to teach on these things. I've been getting actually some very encouraging feedback from some people of faith, even some conspiracy theorists who say, man, this helps me shed this cult I've somehow managed to slip into. So here's the way I don't think that I can in one step deconvert the worst conspiracy theorists. QAnon theorists aren't going to rush out to buy my book, read it, and be cured. It doesn't work that way. I'm offering this book first and foremost to people like you guys who seem open and interested and willing to embrace its lessons. And if you allow those lessons to seep into you and they change the way you assess ideas and the way you hold other people accountable in conversation, the ideas will spread kind of by osmosis. Other people will start to feel that the cultural ethos is changing and their own standards of accountable, and they'll feel compelled to embrace the higher standards of accountable talk. Now, I'm not saying, invite all of your, your cranky Uncle Frank who thinks that, the jackbooted thugs are coming for his guns. I'm not saying invite him over to Thanksgiving dinner and immediately start challenging him using the concepts of cognitive immunology. That's a hard case, and I don't have any easy answers for those who want to rescue loved ones who've fallen into rabbit holes. But you can, through respectful listening, actually, so my book is more about how to prevent bad mind infections than it is about curing them. But there's some really interesting research about how you help people deconvert from a cult, or how you help people shed a conspiracy theory. And the evidence seems to say that one of the best things you can do is just listen respectfully, try to understand the view itself and the underlying motivations, why that view is attractive to the person, and just letting them, by giving them a chance to articulate their worldview, a lot of times they'll start to see for themselves that their views don't add up. One of the most compelling things you can experience to realize that you need to change your beliefs is the realization that when you try to explain it, it doesn't add up. So be a good listener, ask clarifying, try to limit yourself to clarifying questions when it comes to cranky Uncle Frank. Give him enough space so that he can start to hear himself think. And perhaps that will help him wake up and realize that he's kind of drunk the Kool-Aid.
Yeah, I think you've hit on a really important point there. And that's actually come out in several of these webinars that we have done, and several of the other Skeptical Inquirer Presents ones, is that the best way to actually help change somebody else's mind is to listen. And not to actually try and convince them because of the backfire effect. And, or if you have to, the way that you just said is the way to do it. Gentle, clarifying questions where they feel like they're being heard and being understood.
Exactly. And by the way, the Anthony Magnabosco and his small army of street epistemologists are experimenting with some questions that go a little bit beyond clarifying questions. They also ask things like, well, so tell me how you know this, and how confident would you say you are on a scale from 0 to 100? And by what method of believing leaves you so sure? These questions kind of go beyond clarifying to beginning to raise, these are questions that are verging on critical, but they're delivered in such a gentle, disarming way, such a collaborative, curious way that sometimes you have to affect genuine curiosity to get people to respond well to this approach.
Yeah.
But delay critical questions, foreground clarifying questions, and when you do get to the critical questions, ask them very gently in a way that maintains trust. Because if you don't maintain the trust, you're not going to reach them.
Very good point. And I think this ties in well. We're getting close to that time, but I think this is a kind of a good way to maybe wrap this up. But Christopher Turner says, we have all been deeply conditioned in our families and cultures of origin with beliefs about ourselves, others, and the world. Tradition, among other things, is often peer pressure from dead people. If we are so attached to our beliefs that they form part of our identities, then what happens to our identities and our sense of self if we ditch these beliefs? Who are we underneath and separate from our beliefs? So how do we help people navigate that switch from this cultural identity or religious identity to having a growth identity, I guess, as you're saying?
Yeah, so psychologists make this contrast between the growth mindset and the fixed mindset. So if you hitch your identity to a set of beliefs, a lot of times you'll cling to them with great tenacity and your mind will become resistant to learning. That's called the fixed mindset. The alternative is the growth mindset is always willing to update a belief system, both by adding new ideas to it, but also by subtracting out ideas that appear to be dysfunctional in one way or another. So both additive and subtractive learning are important if you want to embody the growth mindset fully. I know there was another aspect to that question, but take me back to it if.
I think, yeah, I'm not sure. Sorry. But this is, oh, go ahead.
I hope I got enough of it to help the person asking.
I think that this would be a good way to actually kind of shift that one. You say hold your beliefs lightly, but I hold some of my beliefs very strongly, such as atheism or veganism, because I'm sure that veganism is the right thing for the animals and for the environment and for human health. And I know that I would never not believe that to be true. I guess I don't see why holding a belief strongly is wrong. So maybe elaborate on that aspect of it.
Good. So I worry sometimes that a commitment to open-mindedness will leave us without conviction. And actually, if you look at the history, you often find that the most open-minded people lack the courage of their convictions. In fact, W.B. Yeats has a poem, The Second Coming, where he says, the best lack all conviction and the worst are full of passionate intensity, right? Some of you may remember that poem. I think to be both open-minded and to have the courage of your convictions is a really tricky balancing act. And in the book, I show precisely how to pull off that balancing act. And here's part of it. You should always be open to the possibility that somebody will raise an objection that will necessitate your renunciation of a favored belief, maybe even your atheism, maybe even your commitment to veganism. But that doesn't mean that the burden of proof is on you. I'm sorry, that doesn't mean that you always have to accept the burden of proof for these views. Sometimes the burden of disproof falls on the other guy. And let's just take, I just want to use a very simple idea here. Let's take the idea that human beings have rights. This is kind of a very clear example for this purpose. Take the idea that human beings have rights. This is a fascinating idea for a number of reasons. Number one is we have zero empirical evidence for it. And yet we humanists, we skeptics, we atheists often embrace this and hold it very close to the center of our belief systems. Why? Because it's useful, not because it's evidentially proven to be true, but because we know from historical experience that it works to protect us from certain kinds of advantage taking. And so that's one thing about the idea that human beings have rights. I also believe that human beings have rights should not be given up easily. That's close enough to the heart. I do have the courage of my convictions when it comes to human beings have rights. And that means I think that claim has been demonstrated, we now have enough historical evidence to accept that claim as hugely useful. We have a right to hold that belief with very significant conviction. And I make a deliberate effort to consider the possibility that an objection that I hadn't anticipated might come along and compel me to revise that opinion. I think that's what open-mindedness really looks like. And if you do it right, you can have the courage of your convictions. You can fight for veganism. You can represent for atheism. So by all means, don't lose the courage of your convictions. Try to test your ideas vigorously. Hang on to the ones that withstand that testing, but always remain open to the possibility that somebody might come along and upset the apple cart. Ooh.
Well, I can't think of a better way to end that. So Andy, Norman, thank you for your time. Do you have any last comments that you'd like to add?
No, I'm happy to end on that note, Jennifer. Thank you so much. And thanks to everyone who showed up tonight.
Well, thank you very much again for your time, to everyone else who joined us. Tonight's video will be up on the website probably sometime tomorrow or the day after, so check that out and find more resources at skepticstoolbox.com and, .org, and we will see you next time. Thank you very much.